Time to talk some fantasy football. That's right. It's never too early to talk fantasy football. I'm Butch Stearns of the Pulse Network, and we're doing it with Billy Enright of fantasyfootballchamps.com. Billy, it's always good on draft day to draft the stars. It's always good to have the rookies that perform. But let's talk about the guys who've either disappointed you in the past, but now you're gun shy to draft them, but they're bounce back candidates. You've got a top 5 list with fantasyfootballchamps.com, and it starts with Peyton Hillis, who's in a new place in Kansas City now.
Yeah, Peyton Hillis was a guy that was an absolute beast in 2010. If you look at what he did, over 1,000 yards rushing, 11 touchdowns on the ground, 60 receptions with another 450-plus yards receiving, and then another 2 touchdowns. But last year, he was awful. He only had 3 touchdowns, didn't even get 25 catches, and he didn't surpass 600 yards. I think he's going to turn things around now that he's in Kansas City. And if you look at his teammate Jamal Charles, these two are a great 1-2 combo. Charles has the speed and the agility, and Peyton Hillis is a bruiser. I think he's going to get some goal line carries and definitely one of my bounce back candidates.
And the Chiefs have recent history with Larry Johnson, Priest Holmes, Christian Okoye, who've done good running back stuff. I like that. Number 2, you have Jeremy Maclin with the Eagles. Deshaun Jackson ties into this, Michael Vick. Why do you have him as a bounce back candidate?
Jeremy Maclin is a guy that, in his second year in the league, he had double-digit touchdowns. He was only about 25 yards from being a 1,000-yard receiver. But last year, he missed 3 games, and he probably would have made that 1,000-yard mark. But he missed 3 games, and he missed a lot of training camp because he had mono. The thing I like most about Jeremy Maclin is, in that West Coast Philadelphia Eagle offense, he's the guy that moves the chains. He's the guy that's going to rack up the receptions and the yards. And I think this is the year that he's going to get 80-plus receptions, over 1,000 yards, and anywhere between 8 or 12 touchdowns. Deshaun Jackson, like you mentioned, he's more of that playmaker, that long-distance guy, the guy that stretches the field. Jeremy Maclin, much more consistent, and consistency is what we like in fantasy football.
Billy Enright of fantasyfootballchamps.com here giving us his top 5 bounce-back candidates for fantasy football this year. And at number 3, you've got Michael Vick. Now, as bad as the Eagles' season was, from a fantasy perspective, Michael Vick wasn't horrible last year.
No, he wasn't horrible, but he was drafted like a top 10 player, and he didn't even finish among the top 10 quarterbacks, let alone top 10 overall. And the biggest factor that affected Michael Vick last year compared to his phenomenal season in 2010, he had 8 less rushing touchdowns and 3 less passing touchdowns. So that's a total of 11 touchdowns, and that is killer when it comes to fantasy stats. Michael Vick is a guy that you want him rushing for those touchdowns as much as possible, because in most leagues, rushing touchdowns are a lot more points than passing touchdowns. So that's a big differential. He went from 9 rushing touchdowns in 2010 to only 1 in 2011.
Billy, on your list of top 5 fantasy football bounce-back candidates for this year, at number 4, you've got Greg Jennings of Green Bay. And my question is why? Because Aaron Rodgers and the Packers, like the Patriots, have become a team where Tom Brady and his favorite receiver are the open receiver. Isn't that the case with the Packers these days?
It absolutely is. And if you look at what Jordy Nelson did, who's really that team's number 2 guy, he had 15 touchdowns last year, which is phenomenal because Aaron Rodgers is just playing lights out. But the reason I have Greg Jennings on this list is he left a bad taste in a lot of fantasy football managers' mouths last year because he missed the last 3 games of the season. And that's the fantasy football playoffs. That's when everyone's relying on him the most, and he wasn't even on the field to contribute. He had less than 1,000 yards. He didn't get double-digit touchdowns. I expect all of that to be okay as long as he stays healthy in 2012.
And you've got a guy as your number 5 bounce-back candidate on your list of top 5 here with fantasyfootballchamps.com. A guy who's a hot button no matter when you bring him up, whether they love him or hate him or whether it comes to fantasy. You've got Jay Cutler as a big bounce-back candidate.
Yeah, Jay Cutler only played in 10 games last year. He missed the final 6 games of the season. He only had 2 games with over 300 yards, and that's because his receivers were awful. Johnny Knox, Devin Hester, these are not viable number 1 targets in the NFL. So what did the Chicago Bears do this offseason? They signed Brandon Marshall, Jay Cutler's former teammate when they were with the Denver Broncos. What did Marshall do when Cutler was under center? 3 straight seasons of over 100 receptions, 3 straight seasons of at least 1,100 receiving yards, and he had 23 touchdowns during that span. Plus, they drafted Alshon Jeffrey out of South Carolina, another big body wide receiver. Jay Cutler finally has the weapons that this guy deserves. I think he can be a steal late in your fantasy drafts this year. I'm really high on Jay Cutler. Tremendous value if you pick him late enough.
There you have it from fantasyfootballchamps.com, the top 5 breakout candidates for the upcoming fantasy football season. Peyton Hillis in Kansas City, Jeremy Maclin and Michael Vick in Philadelphia, Greg Jennings in Green Bay, and Jay Cutler in Chicago. He's Bill Enright of fantasyfootballchamps.com. I'm Butch Stearns of the Pulse Network. This is Football Nation.